and its aggressiveness. Examples like its growing nuclear arsenal, its escalating maritime coercion in the South China Sea, and then, of course, the growing threat that the PRC will attempt to seize Taiwan by force. However, it's the economic challenge from China, as we'll hear more about today, that may actually be the greater strategic threat. Now, not only does the PRC's economic power underpin its ability to build up its military capabilities, but the PRC's economic manipulation and its economic coercion also pose a direct threat to U.S. interests and to the international order. Now, to effectively counter this threat requires mobilizing and synchronizing the efforts of a range of elements in the U.S. government and the private sector, as well as working bilaterally and multilaterally with allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific and around the world. And this working with allies in the Indo-Pacific is really a very timely consideration, given next month's summit meeting here in Washington with Japan's Prime Minister Kishida and President Marcos of the Philippines. So today we'll explore these issues of economic security with a panel discussion, including 3 subject matter experts. And this panel will be moderated by Kash Arha, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. And then the panel will be followed by remarks from Raja Krishnamurthy, ranking member of the House Select Committee on China. Representative Krishnamurthy has been a leading voice in the United States warning of the strategic challenge from the PRC and mobilizing efforts to counter it. So I'm really looking forward to hearing those comments. Now, Dr. Arha previously served as a senior advisor on strategic engagement at the U.S. Agency for International Development, where he co-chaired the Clear Choice Executive Council, working to operationalize U.S. national security strategy and executing U.S. development, assistance, and diplomacy in the global competitive space. He also served as senior transition advisor at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, where he worked with partners in Afghanistan and abroad on the completion and execution of the first tranche of the transition strategy. And he also worked as Deputy Assistant Secretary and Associate Solicitor General in the Department of the Interior. Having received his PhD from UC Berkeley and his JD from Stanford University, Dr. Arha began his career as a senior executive for the state of Wyoming and has experience both as a practicing attorney and as a visiting professor. And so, Dr. Arha, I'll now turn the floor over to you to start off our panel.
Okay. Good morning. Again, thank you very much for the introduction. We'll get right into talking about the economic security of Indo-Pacific and United States. And I couldn't be more pleased and proud of the panel we have. We've got 2 very good colleagues here who I had the pleasure to work with in and out of government, Peter Harrell and Clayton Williams. Both of them served at the White House in probably, I think it's not a stretch to say, most economic policies related to China, related to economic security, related to our engagement with allies. No 2 people had more central role to that in executing it than Cleet in the Trump administration and Pete in the Biden administration. So love to hear from them. And they have continued their work on this area since they've left government and are in private sector. And they're delighted to have Masashi Murano, who leads our sort of Japan program at the Hudson Institute and has been a key scholar in U.S.-Japan relationships. So nobody better to comment on issues in front of us as Prime Minister Kishida comes to town. We talk about economic security and everything that was told earlier. It's a topic that is pretty much on the top of the line for everybody talking about economic security, but not everybody has the same understanding of what we mean when we say economic security. Oftentimes it sort of dwells down into industrial policy, either protectionism or talking about supply chains. So we have a chance here to talk about it in a comprehensive way. And as opposed to having a rather generic discussion on this, we may try to make it more specific related to this report. And this report is an important one. You may see it. It came out in December, but it was prepared by the House Select Committee on China. And it is in some ways the most comprehensive, though I would say incomplete, but the most comprehensive report from the US government side about issues related to economic competition, economic adversarial relationship vis-a-vis the Chinese Communist Party in the United States. And this report, I think, again, came up with a lot of hearings. Some of our panelists were on those hearings. They contributed to what's in that particular report. And it's broken into 3 parts of it. It first talks about, and let me just step back. I think it's important to say what the the premise in the executive sort of summary of it is, it says very clearly that the Chinese Communist Party has followed a policy of strategically decoupling itself from American and other countries so that it's not dependent on them for specific technologies and others. At the same time, policies that would lead that the rest of the world is dependent on China and that it has a certain non-market efforts going around to dominate global supply chain and critical stuff. So in that context, the issue is it's about time for the United States to respond to this. And the committee lays out a comprehensive plan of first resetting American economic relationship with China, in which it talks about how WTO and its succession hasn't worked right, how everything else that follows in a complex and sort of system that works in Chinese economy that is opaque from the outside, but has detrimental impact on America. So we need to reset this relationship. It also then talks about preventing it. So it's an odd situation. America finds itself to be in a strategic competition with a country which economy is very much integrated in the global and American system. And a lot of American capital is actually funding the adversary's growth in technology and defense. It's first time and rather odd place to be. And the third part talks about building not only the American edge, which it has in technologies and make it stronger, but working with allies and how to build a more economic, secure, and resilient economic system to American and to allied benefit. So that's the layout. And I think what I'm going to say now is first punt it to my panelists to have their comments on the report. Broad comments and on the first two part of it, the resetting and the preventing. And then after that, we'll spend the rest of this discussion on the building part that talks about the Indo-Pacific economic security. So Clete, let me start with you, and then we'll go to Pete, and then we'll come up to Mashashit. Over to you, Clete.
Thanks so much, and appreciate your opening remarks, because I agree with a lot of what you said, and in particular, the element of the report that I want to focus on is its comprehensiveness. And I do think right now, as there's some uncertainty about how the China Committee is going to proceed moving forward, there are some changes going on in its leadership. I think one of the services that it's provide, and what I hope will be part of its lasting legacy, is getting us focused on the need for a comprehensive approach to China. And we spend a lot of time talking about tariffs and export controls and investment restrictions and all of these defensive measures. And those are undoubtedly very important and part of the equation, but they're not a solution. They're not a winning strategy in and of themselves. And so when you're cracking down on China, it's really only going to be effective when you work with others, when you work with allies. And that's why I think, the portion of this, about, basically building that alliance is so important. It's something the administration calls align. Whether you have reset, prevent, build, or invest, align, compete, there is this component of working together. I also think it's really important that as you're shutting off market access into China for our companies, you're giving them outlets for it. You're giving them positive incentives to diversify their supply chains. And that's where that part of aligning with others is so important. And of course, you need to be doing things to build your economy at home. So whether you call that, investing or building, having a strong domestic economy is critical to competing with China. Let me comment quickly just on two substantive elements of the first two pillars, and I know we'll spend our time on the third pillar later. I think two really important recommendations. The first is on the recommendation that did not say at the end to revoke PNTR. And this was something that was debated heavily within the committee and was also talked about in the press quite a bit. And what's really interesting to me is where that recommendation ended up on the tariff structure was not to say revoke China's PNTR as a statutory matter, but rather to create a new tariff column. And I think that's really important because it highlights two things. Number one,
just one bit, Clete, I'd request that you spell out all the acronyms so everybody understands what you're talking about, not an inside baseball.
Yeah.
Okay.
China's permanent normal trade relations, which is a status we granted them when they joined the WTO. And there's been a big debate about, they haven't met their WTO commitments, therefore we need to revoke this status. And what the status does is basically gives China the same tariff treatment as a baseline matter as the rest of the WTO members. And there was discussion about whether we should revoke it. And ultimately, the committee decided, let's not say revoke PNTR, let's say create a new tariff column for China. And I thought that was significant for two reasons. Number one, it recognizes that we haven't been treating China the same as WTO members already. We have $360 billion of tariffs in place on them. And then secondly, it recognizes that actually formally revoking that under US statute is not wholly strategic. And it would raise tariffs on things like toys that maybe we don't need to. And it wouldn't raise tariffs as much as it probably should on strategic goods. So they look at creating this holistic new tariff structure for China. And again, I think that is the right approach. It's a little more nuanced, but I think it's a more strategic approach. And so I wanted to highlight that is where they landed after vigorous debate. And then secondly, on outbound investments, something both Peter and I have talked a lot about. We've both testified together on this before Congress. What I like about that approach is that it sort of avoided this false dichotomy between do we need to worry about certain sectors or do we need to focus on certain entities? And it basically said we should do both. There are some sectors where we're concerned about China's growth. There are some bad actors that we've identified, and we need to strengthen both of those measures. Now, the way you do that is important, right? And I think there's a risk that we could be overbroad in both contexts. But nonetheless, I think the recognition that that is a false dichotomy and that there's room for something comprehensive there, I thought was useful. So let me stop there and let the others weigh in.
Okay, Pete, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be on the panel today. And it's great to see you on the screen. First thing I want to do is really congratulate the China Select Committee and the ranking member who's obviously speaking shortly this morning for what I think is a really important and comprehensive document that, Kaush, as you say, lays out at both a strategic level, a kind of strategic framework for how to think about the whole range of economic issues in the US-China relationship. I sometimes feel like, when we are, I sometimes feel like with a number of these economic issues, we're playing whack-a-mole, and a very important game of whack-a-mole, but, we're chasing one particular critical supply chain or one particular technology. And I think the report does a really elegant job of pulling together a strategic framework for how to think about the whole set of strategic, economic, and technological relationships we have with China, while also being quite practical in its recommendations. I mean, I think there are probably about 130 recommendations, 140 recommendations in there. Cleet obviously touched on two of the biggest and most important ones around how to think about the tariff structure and how to think about outbound investment, but 130 others in there. And if you haven't had a chance to read the report, I really would commend all of the audience to read the report, because the recommendations are really quite detailed and practical. And I think it's really impressive at a time when we are in a campaign season, and when there is so much disagreement on so many domestic issues. I think it is really quite impressive to see a report that is this detailed and this comprehensive, that was endorsed on a bipartisan basis by dozens of members of Congress across both committees. And I think it really is a testament to the work of the committee, to the importance of getting the US-China economic and technological relationship right, and to the fact that this is an area where there is bipartisan consensus. We are in a period of strategic competition with China, and we need to mobilize a kind of whole of society approach to making sure that we win that strategic competition. I think I will leave it there, because I know we want plenty of time to get into the third pillar in particular in after we get past the opening remarks.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Musashi, appreciate your thoughts on the report, but also I think it'd be great to hear, the Japanese perspective on economic security per se, not only for Japan, but for the Indo-Pacific as we go forward? Thank you. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me this important event. Personally, that I agree with that. I basically agree with that this report's first and the second pillar. But I think that as a perspective of Japanese perspective, it could be a matter of degree. And how, what I can say that how should we adjust more detail of our economic security policy, and including some export control as well. For example, to begin with, that the cooperation in the field of the economic security is not inherently easy. While the coordination among supplier countries is essential for the export controls to function for economic security. This is because export control directly lead to some reduction in the market share and the home countries' companies. As each country has different exposures and strengths of its own companies, but there are the differences is a loss and the implication of the same regulation, and it is extremely difficult even between the US and Japan to fully reconcile the economic rationally. For example, one of the example is the comprehensive semiconductor production and also its equipment-related export restrictions have the relatively high economic rationale for the US side because of the value of the semiconductor production equipment sales to China is, in case of the US, it's relatively small. However, in case of Japan, that the exports to the China account for roughly 40% of Japan's semiconductor production equipment exports. And the comprehensive semiconductor production equipment related export restrictions are measures with the low economic rationality for Japan. So Japan's current measures on the policy which at the first glance appear to be synchronized with the follow the request from the US, but it's unique measures designed to avoid the low economic rationality for Japan, taking its own interests into the consideration. So this is one of the would be a key agenda to the coming Prime Minister Kishida's state visit, or between not only Japan and the United States, but also US and its allies will be more comprehensively to adjusting to these kind of minor perception gap and interest gap between the US and allies. That's my first comment on that.
All right. Well, thanks again. So let's get to the meat of the issue. I think that I posited this way, and I think again we'll go over to we'll follow the same rule. One, Prime Minister Kishida is going to come to town. If you read the Financial Times yesterday, it talks about how a very big part of it is going to be re-upping our mutual defense pact. So again, it'd be a security deal. A big deal, giving more operational coherence, more operational authority. And that seems to be the dominant sort of American outreach to the Indo-Pacific, is that our security alliances are going very strong, and we believe very strongly in forward positioning of our security alliances with our allies. And now, in a very sort of asymmetrical way, our economic policies are exactly the opposite, which says, let's just come home and build bigger fences. So we have this great asymmetry in which we are very aggressive in security alliances, but not as much in economic alliances when we are basically dealing with an economic competition. So that's one oddity that is there. And I like the second oddity that we have is that we talk, like my good friend Pete mentioned, whack-a-mole, and Pete reference to it too. we have looked at some necessary conditions of engaging and prevailing against China in an economic competition, and shrouded ourselves with the confusion that these are sufficient. So they're far from sufficient. They may be necessary, and they may be necessary on the sort of, we haven't, so let me look at this report. The reset part is important, but we need to do a lot more of it. The body of it is in the prevent side of it. I mean, if I had to put where this report has gone the farthest, it's on the prevent end of it. We've got more CFIUS, we need to more tariff structures. All those are, I mean, these are absolutely important and necessary, but far from sufficient. And so I think a comprehensive strategy, because so why are we doing it? Not for any globalist reasons, but because Wall Street, Kansas and Nebraska farmlands, Silicon Valley, where peat is at the moment, or Houston, where energy is. Any of those areas, we are the world leaders in it. And we sell and engage with the world a hell of a lot more than we do it. So if we're not engaging with the world and setting up an economic security and resilience system that is favorable to us, it affects Wall Street, it affects the middle America farmlands, it affects Silicon Valley, it affects our oil and energy ports. So we need to address this, and I think we've got a lot more to do than what's here, and I'd love to hear, I think, bold points on it. And we're not going to be hedging sort of politically. We're in the business of saying what the right policy is. When we've donned political hats, we'll be in the business of what's practical and but we cannot take that here. So we're not speaking as politicians, but as policy people, what needs to be done. So Cleet, you wrote a heck of a report, which I need to champion as much as this one, which was reimagining TPP and how we can get back in there for our own interest, for no other purpose. So we'd love to hear from you, and we'll go to Pete.
Yeah. Well, look, you've got me fired up. I'm not going to lie. And I think you've already started to lay out pretty clearly the case for why we need more comprehensive U.S. economic engagement in the region. But let me start here, which is the fact is that while we are focused almost exclusively on defense, both in terms of sort of protective measures and defense treaties, you know, China is not sitting on the sidelines when it comes to the economic agenda. I mean, they are aggressively pursuing trade agreements throughout the region. They're cutting tariffs with countries around the region, making it much easier for those countries to link their supply chains with China instead of the United States. And so I think we as a country need to have the same sense of urgency that I felt in 2017 when we first started exposing the risks from Belt and Road, and the way that that allowed China to really achieve a whole range of economic and geopolitical goals, to engage in economic coercion. The more we let them create supply chain networks without providing a meaningful alternative, the worse position we're going to be in as a country. And so, as you alluded to, I mean, I've done a lot of work in this area, and really it's just been trying to create a sense of urgency among U.S. policymakers. I mean, I'm at the point where I don't think rejoining TPP right now, even renegotiating it and trying to create a USMCA version of it in the Indo-Pacific, I don't think we're going to be able to do that right now politically. So what I like about this report is that it actually tries to think about what are the first steps we can take towards that path to get that muscle memory back, to get more comfortable with trade agreements. And let me highlight two specific recommendations. The first is on the bilateral FTA front. The report recommends FTAs with Taiwan, the UK, and Japan. I won't belabor all of these other than to say I agree. I think these are countries where you don't have the same political problems because you don't have sort of a, labor, competing on cost and things like that. They're more developed countries. And I think with Taiwan, if what we want to do is avoid conflict on the strait, and if what we want to do is avoid China from being able to coerce and take over Taiwan, we do need to help diversify their trade. And right now they're about 30% dependent on China. That gives China a big, massive tool that they can use. And I think we need to help them create other supply chain linkages around the world so that they're less susceptible to that kind of coercion. There's also a huge economic benefit for the United States Taiwan actually has much higher tariffs than we do. And so if we had an FTA, our trade would be more reciprocal. So there are a lot of reasons to move forward with Taiwan. And then the other recommendation that I think is really great is on sectoral agreements. And I think here the concept is, if it's too challenging to do a comprehensive FTA for political or substantive reasons, let's start with the areas that we really care about, where we need to diversify away from China, where we need supply chains to be more linked with partners and allies through a friendshoring concept, and let's do deals there. And one of the areas the report highlights is medical supply chains. It also looks at critical minerals. And I would add to that, probably we could do more, you know, on batteries and things like that. I mean, I think generally speaking, this concept of sectoral agreements as a first step is something that has a lot of promise. And I would hope that either in a second term Biden, where maybe there's a little more political flexibility, they could look at adding sectorals onto IPEF, so you actually have real meaningful market access provisions instead of a lot of consultations. Or in a Trump administration, this could be something we would do with countries like Europe, where a comprehensive really isn't on the table. So I just throw those two things out as some of the most important recommendations from my perspective.
Thanks, Clete. I mean, just to back to you, Pete, with two more things just to add to Clete. One, it's not only that China is aggressively pursuing trade agreements, all our allies are also aggressively trade other than us. The India signing FTA with Europe, European Union is very aggressively engaged in the party. West Asian countries are going back and forth. And just another sector to look at, that we got to dominate the digital governance going forward. So we got to do a lot more work as a sectoral, just so that the rules of the game on the digital side are written by us and like-minded folks. Over to you, Pete. So what's the statecraft view on these things?
Well, thanks. And I actually want to start by talking a little bit about the investments that we're trying to make here at home in resilience, because I think there's a really important reality that even for the investments we want to make here at home for resilience, we need our allies and partners on board. You know, if you think about electric vehicles and the transition, whether it's over 10 years, over 20 years to electric vehicles, you know what the companies that make good batteries for electric vehicles are? They're not American. They're Panasonic out of Japan, makes all the batteries for Tesla. They're Samsung and LG and SK out of South Korea that make batteries for Ford and for VW. And so I think it's really important to make sure that we are showcasing and making sure that these, you know, allied nation countries have the opportunity to come here and invest here. And I bring up the battery example because not only because it's sort of an important issue for electric vehicles, but also because I think we face some important choices as a country about what we're going to do to attract that investment here. And are we going to attract that investment, or are we going to let, you know, not let that investment come in? And so I think even for the resilience we want to see here, we have to think about the allies and partners. Another example, of course, is semiconductors, where Taiwan's TSMC makes the most advanced semiconductors in the world. And if we want to make those semiconductors here, we got to attract TSMC, which is building a fab in Arizona to make semiconductors here. So it's not just about thinking about trade agreements, it's making sure we maintain and promote that open investment environment for our allies to come here. And I do think it's important that we, as we look at these investments and we think about the CFIUS process, we have a CFIUS process that is set up to allow that allied investment to come in and work very effectively here in the United States. I want to pick up on the trade side, kind of where Clete left it. And I think the House Select Committee report and others have talked a lot about maybe pivoting to a sectoral agreement approach to trade. And I am hopeful that in the next administration, whether it is a Biden term 2 or a Trump term 2, we will have some serious discussions here in the United States about a real sectorally driven approach to trade policy, because I do think we need to be realistic on the political realities of kind of going back into TPP or that sort of thing, which I just don't think politically is on the table. But I think you could put together a sectoral agreement, either, on a couple of key critical supply chains, whether it's minerals or medical goods. I think you could build some support for a sectoral agreement there. Or, Kosh, very much where you are, I think the other really ripe opportunity for a sectoral agreement is in the digital space. I think, we have a world we face where governments around the world are kind of racing off to regulate the tech sector, to set their own standards for data localization, and to limit the free flow of data with trust, as our Japanese friends would talk about, to limit that. And I think the way we as Americans can push back on these trends that have the potential to be adverse, not just for sort of American tech companies, but for tech and innovation globally, is to really come out with support for some sort of digital or digital economy sectoral agreement in the next presidential term. And I really think we need to be thinking about what that would look like and how to build support so we could go out and do that in the coming years. The final point I want to make that I think is in the report, I think innovation is a really important part of competing with China. And I think the report does highlight the need to focus on innovation and R&D. I'm writing a book on security economics, and I'm looking at some of the history of how we've addressed these challenges in the past. If you look at 1940, FDR kind of realizes we're going to war. In going to war, America is going to lose access to 90% of the world's rubber supply because it's grown in Southeast Asia. And of course, rubber is going to be essential for the war effort. Solution in 1940 was not to go conquer Brazil as an alternative provider. It was to get rubber companies, both in the US and in Britain, to figure out ways to make synthetic rubber as an alternative. So you see a kind of innovation-driven approach to solving the supply chain resilience crisis that FDR was looking at. And I think we need to have that kind of thinking now of how can we work with allies and partners to innovate our way out of some of these problems, as well as thinking about more sort of traditional ways of securing access to key supplies.
Thanks, Pete. Really appreciate it. I think the point about investing here is good. There's slight irony in you mentioning it since we're dealing with the Nippon steel stuff, but nonetheless, an important...
You bring that up, and I do want to make a comment on that. Look, I think CFIUS has a process for looking at legitimate national security risks and as a way of mitigating those. And I certainly hope that we are able to get to a point where, any national security risks, whether it is guarantees of sales to DoD or things like that, can be mitigated, and this deal can be approved to close. And I think that would be an important message to the Japanese.
Yes. So over to the Japanese quickly, because I think we've got the congressman waiting. So over to you, Masashi, I think.
Well, specifically to say about the Nippon Steel, the things that there has been some negative reaction from the Biden administration, not only the Republican parties, regarding the acquisition of US Steel. Also that I understand that domestic situation in the US, but the politicizing this matter will only lead to the deterioration of the USChina Corporation and will only help China. So to begin with, this is not the hostile takeover, but under some agreement between the management of the two companies. So Nippon Steel has accumulated the technologies in advanced fields such as the electrical steel seats, for which the demand is expected to the increasing of the EVs applications, and plans to transfer this technology to its U.S. production facilities as well. So that I think that this would be the strengthening of U.S. supply chain in EV sector, which is the competition with China. So that I think that it's solved in between some government and the companies.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mr. I'm going to filibuster a little bit until you figure out where the congressman comes in a minute or two. So I'll come back to you guys in this kind of issues. I think the notion of going with sectoral, I couldn't agree more with on the innovation side, the digital element of this. I would push back a little bit. I think the two things that just to keep in mind. One, I think the word trade is more toxic than what's in it. So I think this notion of talking about trade agreements, I agree with you that is probably not the most politically opportune time. But the issues of economic security alliances, which has elements within that, whether it be sectoral, whether there be supply chain, which may have some market access issues in it. I think that's the way to go. So we're looking for an Indo-Pacific Economic Security Pact, an Indo-Pacific Economic Security alignment, just like we are doing military. And I think both America and the people are the right way to look at it because of the points you guys mentioned, which was that we're looking at a totality, whole of society, Pete, as you said, whole of government to try to engage in this exercise. And we're not going to engage in it if we don't talk about economic security the same way we talk about military security. And then when we talk about economic security, you got to level with people and say, hey, there's going to be some cost on American citizens. It is not a free ride. Some things may be a little bit more expensive, some things may be other way. So I think those are important points to make. And I see that the filibuster had worked well, and we're delighted. I see the the face of the great congressman from Illinois, Raj Krishnamurthy. Sir, first of all, good morning, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. We're delighted to have you. We're big fans of you, and we're just talking up your report. So I want to welcome you and have your opening comments, and I've got 2 or 3 questions for you. So first of all, thank you again for your leadership on the China Committee. Thank you for the tremendous bipartisan effort on the TikTok divestment. Thank you again for the most comprehensive and sort of single-standing U.S. government approach for economic competition and prevailing that competition with the Chinese Communist Party. So delighted to have you. Over to you, Congressman Krishnamurthy, sir.
Well, gosh, thank you so much. With such nice comments like that, I'm not sure if I should say anything more. And maybe I'll just save my statements for the trial. In any case, I just want to say thank you to Atlantic Council. Thank you to Kosh. Thank you to all of you, all your distinguished panelists. I'm just honored to join you. If it looks like I'm talking to you from inside of a college classroom, the answer is yes, I am. I'm actually at Malcolm X College this morning in Chicago, Illinois, where we are participating in the U.S. Patent and Trade Office's China IP Roadshow. You may be wondering, what the heck is that? Actually, the USPTO puts on a series of seminars around the country talking about how it's important to protect your intellectual property from potential infringement by CCP-affiliated actors or by others in the PRC. And, I think this is really important because, as you know, IP theft is a huge concern and a downright problem in our relationship. Upwards of $600 billion of IP theft occurs annually. And so this is something that our constituents, our small and large businesses and others want us to tackle. I'll stop right there, and I'd love to hear your questions, comments, or of course your compliments.
Well, once again, thank you. I think very important issue, IP. And so since we're talking about sort of difficult not to start from TikTok, so I think we need to have your point. It wasn't, first of all, people need to realize how important the vote itself it was, the 350 to 60 some odd thing, and in a bipartisan way. And the importance, again, of that particular case, but something gets lost among these opponents of it. They presume that there is no alternative to it, and there are multiple alternatives. So, and the good case study to that is India. When India sort of banned TikTok, and you have there were 200 million users. We have 170. They had 200 million users. And that was banned overnight. And just like us, they had tremendous amount of small, middle, and just entrepreneurs who were selling stuff on TikTok, both through government intervention and others. Almost all of them are now using Instagram or Yahoo or YouTube or any of those measures. And I think a good article on this was presented yesterday by New York Times. So I think that point really got lost in this. And the national security issues are absolutely, as you mentioned. I mean, there are national security laws in China that says a Chinese company, when asked to turn over data, has no other option than turning over data and remaining quiet about it. So I think those are important things, but good to hear from you the relevance and the great importance of this action that you helped take. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Kash. So this particular piece of legislation, bipartisan legislation, is not a ban. It requires a divestment by ByteDance of TikTok. And for most of your viewers, they probably already know that ByteDance is the 100% owner of TikTok. It is a PRC-based company that is basically controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. The editor-in-chief of ByteDance is actually the general secretary of the CCP cell that's embedded at the very highest levels of ByteDance to ensure that all products of ByteDance, including TikTok, adhere to, quote, correct political direction. And that's exactly what they've done with that platform, and we can talk more about that. The second point I want to make is we are trying to balance the legitimate constitutional concerns of individuals with our national security concerns. And that's why we're requiring this divestment. It's not without precedent. Another very popular app called Grindr, which is a popular LGBTQ dating app, was actually acquired by a Chinese company. When the US government found out that the CCP had access to very sensitive data, personal data, about LGBTQ members of the military and government officials, they required the divestment of the app. It happened like that. It happened very quickly. The app is very valuable, much like TikTok, and there was no disruption to users. And I think the exact same thing will likely occur with TikTok. And as you said, it won 352 votes in the House. Nothing gets that many votes anymore on anything of this level of complexity. And that just goes to show how broadly the legislation addresses people's concerns and tries to strike the right balance.
Well, again, also, I think this is not out of the ether. We're basically talking up your report, sir. So we put it out, and I think this is an extraordinary report that your committee put out, the Reset, Prevent, Build. And the TikTok provision comes out of this particular report, as you've identified in the resetting part of this report, that there are important Chinese-held companies that have intruded into the American system and then had the control of which TikTok obviously is one. But we basically were complimenting you and that committee's great work on coming up with a comprehensive report. The reset part of WTO and economic relations is pretty strong. The prevent part is probably the strongest in what we need to do, and I think good work has been done. And then probably the build part has a lot of room to grow as we. So I'd like to hear from your side how you see the three components and where you see the greatest sort of likelihood of forward movement in upcoming months. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Kash, and thank you for, again, all of the nice things you're saying about our report. I approve that message, so thank you. Well, look, I think that with regard to the three components, you're absolutely right. This report won basically unanimous support from 24 members of our committee. And again, every word appeared to be negotiated in this particular report because the issues are sensitive. Let me start backwards for a second with the build part, because that's sometimes the part that people don't necessarily hear much about, but is very important. That goes to investing in our own competitiveness as a country. So for instance, fixing our legal immigration system, investing in basic and applied research, which unfortunately has not been taken up as a priority by this Congress. But this committee on a bipartisan basis said, invest in NSF, invest in NIST, and invest in NIH, invest in our capabilities to compete at the highest levels in emerging technologies of the future. It also talks about upgrading the skills of our workforce to make sure that everyone, regardless of whether you go to a four-year college or community college or any kind of post-secondary institution, that you're able to participate in the data revolution of the future, the digital revolution of the future, and technologies of the future. With regard to the other components, very briefly, as you mentioned in the prevent section, I think that there is a lot of momentum for some of those pieces of legislation. TikTok was among them, as you mentioned. And then in the reset, that goes a lot to the issue of our trade relationship. Our trade relationship is broken. I'm just going to say it. I know it's not politic to talk about it in those terms, but although we are both in the World Trade Organization, China has adopted such an aggressive posture with regard to its trade relationship with regarding the United States, especially the dumping. And I hear about dumping like all the time at this point from small and large businesses, that essentially we've had to adopt countermeasures that kind of take us out of the spirit of the WTO as it was conceived. And so we just have to recognize that, and we have to counsel the CCP. Basically, look, we would love to go back to a regime that is envisioned by the WTO, but you got to drop your aggressive trade and dumping measures so that we can start to lower our countermeasures. There are other aspects that we need to work on, but those are just some of them I wanted to mention.
So just on that, I think a very important point that you mentioned, which is about overcapacity and dumping. I mean, just simply put, Chinese economy does not follow market signals as well because it's a state-owned, state capitalist model. As a result, it ends up with overcapacity. As a result, it dumps it on global markets and affects us and affects our allies in multiple ways. The response to that is a collective allied response. We have an effort here to say we can work on a sector by sector basis. Yes, we can, but that doesn't address this comprehensive dumping stuff, which actually, going back to one-on-one economic, sectoral sector is a politically good argument, but economically inefficient one. It never has worked out, but it sounds good. So in a way to address the dumping thing, we basically have to say either we work through WTO, but if that is not functional, then we are setting up economic security alliances with our partners in the Indo-Pacific, with our partners in Europe, with our partners in the Western Hemisphere, that we are collectively going to address this dumping thing. So I think, because other than that, there is no way to address it. It's not a whack-a-mole that you address dumping issues. So how do you think best way to go forward on that? As we go forward, forget the trade business. I think we're in the economic security alliance business now.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I think that, see, I'm going to step back for a second. Why do they dump? They dump because the state has decided that they want to occupy the commanding heights, not just of political control, but economic control. And they want to be able to allocate capital and not necessarily leave it up to the free enterprise system there to decide where it goes. So basically, they build too much housing, and so they have a housing bubble that burst, and now it's crashed. They build too much steel. They make too much electronics. They make too many electric cars, and so that's a way for them to get employment and make sure people have jobs. But what it does is it basically creates this overcapacity. And then they decide, well, let's just sell it for, we're going to undercut our competition worldwide and then drive those companies out of business. So what we have to do is we have to work with our partners and allies and friends to adopt countermeasures as a group, as a whole, to dissuade the CCP from doing this. One area that is going to come up, and perhaps you guys have already talked about this, but it's going to come up like very quickly now, is electric vehicles. They are dumping electric vehicles around the world, and they're going to try to do the same in America through Mexico, okay? They're going to try to use the USMCA to basically bring electric vehicles through USMCA into the American economy, and they're going to try to undercut Detroit. We can't let that happen, and that's why I am saying, and Mike Gallagher and I and Republicans and Democrats are saying, look, let's get ahead of this curve. We don't want to be in a situation where tomorrow our EV industry is destroyed, is in tatters, and then we complain about spilt milk. We have to kind of work in advance and basically say, look, this is not going to work. We're not going to allow BYD to come here, and they're building their own dream and creating a nightmare in the process for American industry.
Sir, I think also one of the things we talked about in the build part of the report was to have sort of stronger economic bilateral relations with Taiwan, with Japan, with UK, as you were talking about it. And I hear rumors that you may be headed some in that direction. So it'd be great to hear from you as to what your thoughts are on our Taiwan relationship and also with Japan, since the Prime Minister is coming to town.
Yeah, he is a visit for next month. So with regard to Taiwan, I was just there 2 weeks ago with Mike Gallagher and other members of the committee. We met with the new president elect, Mr. Lai, William Lai, and the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, but we also met with all the different political parties. And I think what they are interested in from us is, first of all, they want the double taxation relief legislation to pass out of the Senate. It's passed out of the House. We need to pass it out of the Senate so that Taiwanese investment income in the United States is not taxed twice. And that's good for us at the end of the day. Why? Because we want to incentivize more Taiwanese investment to help to fuel the CHIPS and Science Act. They've already brought a lot of investment into Arizona, TSMC has, but as you know, a whole ecosystem is likely to follow in addition to TSMC, if we can just get our taxation situation correct. As far as a free trade agreement, I know that that's high on their agenda, and that's something that we've been talking about. Interestingly, Taiwan is a huge importer of American products. For Illinois alone, they are the #2 and #3 importers of corn and soy, Kosh, which is really remarkable for a country of Taiwan's size. But what I'm telling my friends and colleagues is, look, this is potentially an opportunity to kind of build our relationship, incentivize more Taiwanese investment here and purchase of our products, and build that economic resilience that they require for their security as well.
Well, thank you, sir. And I think I've got only a few minutes of your time, so I want to give a little bit of time to my two colleagues to say if they wanted to say any words to you, both Cleet and Peter, and then I'll have those concluding remarks before we go away. So since you mentioned Taiwan, let me turn it over to Cleet. Cleet, just quick notes.
Sure. So Congressman, let me just say congratulations on a great report and on all the work you're doing over there. I hope the Lions-Bears routine will be just as good as the Packers-Bears routine that you've got with Congressman Gallagher, because that bipartisan element is so important. Two just really quick comments. I mean, first on Taiwan, I've been talking about this earlier in the session about how important it is to try to do a trade agreement there, and you hit on a really good point about the export market that it is. And I think you've done a great job on talking about the geopolitical importance, and I think together we got to talk about the economic benefit. The comment and the question I have for you though is about you were talking about EVs We were also talking about dumping, and that's, you know, the steel industry has been an area where that's happened. And I think one solution there that we haven't quite said yet, but I wonder what your thoughts are on it, is this concept of a common external tariff, and whether the US and Canada and Japan, can we all get to a scenario where we put common external tariffs on China and then we trade freely among each other? Do you think that there is the political will for that kind of thing? Because there's both a strong on China component, but then a free trade internal component. And just wondering your thoughts on that.
Okay,
That's-
before I get, let me take Pete's point, and then we'll give you the last word to you, Congressman. Over to you, Pete.
Thank you. And Congressman, I just want to echo Cleet and Caution and congratulating you on the report. I mean, it really is just a terrific report, and all the work you and Congressman Gallagher and the other members of the committee have been doing, I think, have been incredibly influential in shaping the debate in Washington and identifying a bunch of specific recommendations for action around town. So really congratulations. I guess I also want to pick up with a question on the dumping issue, but maybe take this in a little bit of a different direction, because I think, you know, one way you can think about kind of common action on things like EVs is a common tariff kind of approach. The other approach that I think you're seeing the Biden administration try to pick up here is to emphasize some of the national security risks of these products, right? So you have this investigation into the national security risks of Chinese connected cars. And I'd kind of welcome your views on how we should think about using some more of these national security tools to deal with this dumping issue, particularly in high-tech products.
Thanks, Pete. Masashi, have you got a quick comment on before I turn it back to the Congressman? Okay, so Congressman, I think these are little technical issues that we have thrown at you. My point to you on this would be the following: that one, sir, you know, we're here to help fine-tune the sort of application and the administration, the execution of your report as we go forward. So there's a lot of room to work on it. And I think this is a kickoff, and I hope you would come and use this as so that we can look at specific recommendations that are in it, either in a broad or specific, how we can move that forward. And the second is, you know, with your concluding comments, feel free as much or as little as you may want to talk in the details of the trade stuff. But you and Mike have been a tremendous group, and we're going to lose Mike. But I hope that, you know, with your stalwart leadership, it'd be good to hear from you in the signing off as to how the committee goes forward under your leadership, continues the good work that it's been doing, and particularly because you're the only one who's taken the cudgel on this economic stuff with this report, and we need to flush this out in bringing the country along with us. So over to you, Congressman, with your concluding remarks. Only one of many to come, hopefully, down this economic security argument. Back to you, sir.
Well, Kosh, thank you so much. You're so kind, and I really look forward to. So Mike Gallagher has been just a great partner to work with. He is a Green Bay Packers fan, as someone mentioned before, but don't hold that against him. You know, everyone has their weaknesses. But in all seriousness, he's a good guy, and we're going to miss his leadership. John Molinar is excellent as well. I work very well with John from Detroit, or from Michigan, I should say. And I really look forward to kind of continuing this bipartisanship. With regard to the technical comments that you made, great questions and comments again. I think the common external tariff idea is fascinating. It's something that we have to kind of think about, because at the same time that we you know, enact tariffs on the CCP and ask others to do the same, there's got to be an incentive to play by the rules of the road. And so that incentive, if it means kind of more market access for players who are abiding by the rules of the road, that's something that we have to talk about. And then with regard to the national security risks associated with some of these vehicles, especially the autonomous vehicles, maybe that's what you were also talking about. But yeah, with regard to these autonomous vehicles, we're very concerned because they are road testing throughout the country. They are gathering data. Interestingly, they are allowed to roam free in, for instance, California. I think California has like 7 different autonomous vehicle providers, and they're all electric vehicles as well. But of those 7, I think only 2 are actually American. The rest are Chinese. And they are gathering data. They are mapping the topography, the terrain, the basically everything about California and other states at this point. And interestingly, there's no reciprocity. We cannot do the same in China, which is absolutely crazy. I don't understand why we would stand for this. And yet, that is the current situation. My good friend Haley Stevens, who's on the committee, who also represents Detroit area, brings this up repeatedly. And when we visited Detroit on a field trip, so to speak, this was something that the big 3 brought to our attention as well. And so they are also concerned about the national security risks associated with these Chinese companies doing what they're doing at the same time that they're also undercutting us economically. The last point I would make on that is, I think that even if we were able to deal with the national security challenges associated with those autonomous vehicles and the LiDAR and the other issues that come into play there, there's still the economic aspect of these electric vehicles that requires other tools to be employed to prevent the dumping and the destroying of our EV industry. So, but excellent points. And so I'm gonna talk about these as well. And I really appreciate all of your input.
No, thank you very much, sir. I think one of the collective stuff is that your report is great. To execute it, you need a Leatherman, not just a scalpel. You need a multiple tool sort of a thing. And in that way, we can sort of help you with this gathering in a regular basis, at your point, to see which tool applies where best as we go forward. To that end, sir, thank you again for your time and look forward to continuing the conversation. Good luck to you. Okay.
Bye.
Okay, back to the panel. Thanks a lot. I think, as I said, this is one of many. I think we should continue this conversation quickly. Go around. Clete, you got any concluding thoughts?
I think I've shared a lot. It's been great to be here with you. Thank you for your leadership on this. And I do think it would be great to get into a productive conversation about how you couple, I think as the congressman just mentioned, how do you couple tough on China with sort of the incentive for friendshoring between the allies. And I think those 2 things need to work together better than they have, and look forward to working with you and others on how to execute on that policy.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Pete?
No, I just want to thank you for inviting me to be here. It's been a really fruitful and interesting discussion. Look forward to carrying it forward. Very much agree with Clete, and point you made at the beginning, Kosh, we got to integrate this. We got to think this as an integrated set of tools and an integrated strategy. And I think that's kind of work all of you guys at Atlantic Council are well positioned to drive.
Japan is our strongest and best partner in the Indo-Pacific. Couldn't be more proud to have the Prime Minister here. Musashi, you have the last word.
Again, thank you very much for inviting me here. And also that we've already recognized what is the programs and the challenges, but the point is that how to implement those kind of policies. So that I hope to the Prime Minister Kishida's state visit to be one of the key steps to be going forward to adjusting the gaps and the differences, and it could be one of the essential part of the U.S.-Japan alliance. Thank you.
Well, milk and honey to your mouth. Okay, God bless. Thanks a lot, and till next time. Okay, thanks again. Bye.